Is Zakkiyyah there?
She disappeared.
Hi, everyone. I'm Max Warsh, Director of Programming at NADA. Thank you for joining us for the final conversation of the Chicago Gallery Open. We are excited to have this conversation surrounding themes from Goldfinch's group exhibition, A Mirror, a Dish, a Window, with Elizabeth Lalley, exhibition organizer and assistant director, and artists Zakkiyyah Najeebah Dumas-O'Neal, James Cow, and Ann Toebbe. Please write any questions you have in the chat, and we will give the artists an opportunity to answer them towards the end of the conversation. And with that, I will hand it off to Elizabeth. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Max. Thank you for everyone who is joining us today. As Max said, my name is Elizabeth Lalley, and I'm the Assistant Director of Goldfinch here in Chicago. I'm the organizer of one of our two current exhibitions on view, A Mirror, a Dish, a Window, which brings together 6 artists who are all, through a range of media, exploring the landscape of interior or domestic space and its relationship to kind of emotional or psychological interiority. As they consider how memory and time exist within dwelling spaces, these artists also reveal certain emotional and psychological wavelengths that exist between us and our homes. So I'm happy to be here today with 3 of the artists from the show, Zakkiyyah, James, and Ann, to talk a little bit more about their works in the exhibition. And I'll begin by briefly introducing each of them. So Zakkiyyah is back. I was worried Zakkiyyah vanished.
The internet here at the studio is really shaky sometimes, so I apologize.
Zakkiyyah is a Chicago-based visual artist, educator, and independent curator whose practice borrows from visual traditions such as social portraiture, video assemblage, collage, and found images. Her work has been exhibited widely, including exhibitions at Ads Donna, Mana Contemporary, Heaven Gallery, and more. And she currently holds the 2019 to 2020 Jackman Goldwasser residency at the Hyde Park Art Center, which I believe you're in your studio there now. James holds an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and has exhibited widely in Chicago and beyond, including presentations at the Elmhurst Museum, China projects in San Francisco, and Boundary Space here in Chicago. He is currently Associate Professor of Art at Aurora University. And lastly, Ann holds her MFA from Yale and has had solo exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Manya Row Gallery, Tibor de Nage, Sarah Lawrence College, and many more. And they are all much more than their biographies. So I'm excited to start talking a little bit more about their works in the show. And to start, I wanted to just see if we could talk more about the relationship between interiority, so sort of psychological space, emotional space, and kind of the physical dwelling spaces where we spend much of our time, whether these are sort of more abstract representations of these questions or really exploring rooms and bodies in rooms. And Zakkiyyah, I thought we could start with you and this new series of photos that are in the show, a series collectively called More Urgent Than the Determination of Dates, which I hope you can talk a little bit more about that title and sort of how you have been thinking about this relationship between interiority and kind of thought and memory and the intimacy of homes and spaces.
Yeah, so that title actually comes out of a quote from a book that was suggested to me years ago by a curator named Lakeisha Leak, and I ended up buying it. I have the book here, actually, The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard. And when I immediately started reading it, I think I just sort of became consumed by it, because I think about the relationships between interiority, memory, space, environments, and architecture all of the time. And so for me, that really started through my photographic practice. And I'd always had this desire or this interest in photographing people in their own spaces and in their home spaces. But I didn't really start that with myself. And so that sort of led me to wanting to document my everyday within a physical space. And I think that just got exacerbated because of COVID more recently, and having to stay at home and be at home. There was sort of a heightened self-awareness that happened about being physically contained for long periods of time. And so I started to kind of meditate on that. And instead of allowing my anxiety or fears kind of overrun my mind, I just started taking images of the space that I was in. And I was quarantining with my partner at the time and really thinking about a lot of things regarding tenderness and closeness and connection. And I had also have always been a fan of filmmakers like Maya Deren, contemporary filmmakers like Alima Lee, as well as others who have been thinking about how to document spaces, whether that's through photo or video, in a way that incites nostalgia or memory, or this idea of a shared experience. I think there are a lot of people, not all people, but there are a lot of people, regardless of, in some cases, race, gender, or circumstance, who can kind of relate to this idea of making home and like being at home. And I really wanted to articulate that with this particular series. And the sort of aesthetic that I was drawing from actually was film and cinema, and sort of using subtitles to articulate my interior thoughts about being in these spaces. And I think reading The Poetics of Space sort of gave me just like a further framework and articulation around how to think about this. And also just thinking about a sort of practice of Black interiority. I look at a lot of artists who have been using the color Black, or, you know, making notes on physical interiority as well as psychological interiority, thinking a lot about folks like Torkwase Dyson, or, you know, architects like Mario Gooden, who are sort of asking these questions about physical interiority and containment, but as they relate to the movement of Black bodies. And I think in this particular containment, I didn't want to think about my Black body as a site of marginalization, but rather a site for tenderness and softness and openness, and something that could just exist in that space outside of all of the political mayhem and things that were going on the outside, but really sort of honing in on that inside space and really thinking about my place there and what I could make of it, as a space for dreaming and thinking and processing, and also a space for slowness.
Mm-hmm. And I think I should note too that while sort of the impulse to organize a show around these questions of interiors, it was a pre-COVID idea that certainly, you know, as the show came together in these times, you know, it has a new kind of maybe resonance, and we'll talk more about that later. But I do think that's important to note as we're kind of talking, that while these questions are ones that all of you have thought about, you know, in your practices for a long time, the work is all new, fairly new, and, you know, acknowledges these days spent inside in different ways. Anne and James, do you have any thing to add about kind of how you think about that sort of the inside space of, you know, of thought, and sort of how it manifests in our spaces and how you represent that?
I'll jump in for a second. You know, look, my home is probably the only space in the world that I can navigate completely in the dark. It's a comfortable space for me, but if I don't sleep well for some reason and wake up at 3 a.m., there's no need to turn the lights on. I can go and get a glass of water and I'm fine. Everything in the house is filled by me, more or less. And so that familiarity is very comforting. But even still, that there are things that come out and strike me. Like in Ann's paintings, I think there's like the three paintings that are, I think, or 3 or 4 paintings in the show. There's like the red orange that's kind of throughout all of the works. So there might be a thing in my home where all of a sudden I see a color that I hadn't seen before, and I just see it everywhere. And in Zakkiyyah's work, I think that the image of the tulips, that is really striking, of a really strange space. It's a very familiar space. There's records in the background, but it's also on the floor, which is, we might expect tulips to be on a table. And that in itself is all pretty arresting, but then there's that photographic burn in the bottom right. And so those kinds of like unexpected things are, in a very familiar space, that they stand out. And those are things that I think for my practice can become very important.
That makes me think of what I wanted to ask too about kind of time as it relates to each of your practices. But I think in The Poetics of Space, Zakkiyyah Bachelard talks about how time as it works in our homes is kind of strange and different because of the way we're surrounded by, things that affect us very deeply through memory and sort of these associations. And so there's often sort of a nonlinear way that we think in our homes when we, have certain rhythms and privacy. And I think, Anne, in your paintings, I'm curious about how you think about time and sort of memory. There's often this like flattening that you use, flattening of space, sort of multiple orientations, all existing together, perspectives. And I always think of it relating to sort of conflicting memories in our homes and with certain occupants and with family members. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so with these 3 works, these are, it's interesting for me to even look at my own work as these 3, because I made these in the spring when we were all at home. And I haven't spent that much time in my own home in many years in the way I did in the spring. But to go back to how I started this type of interior painting it was from a very sincere place. I would argue that now it maybe comes from a more critical place, but when I started, I had really intended to figure out a way to represent memories that, it was when I was a young artist and I was sorting through who I am. I think that's how we all begin. And I was trying to figure out how the lens that I saw my life, which was much shorter, it was a much shorter way to look. I was in my 20s, so I'm looking back at a much shorter period of time and realizing that a lot of what I had seen, wasn't as it was. So memory was tricking me. Things that I thought were very, peaceful or wonderful memories as a child turned out to be fraught with many more family conflicts and things that I wasn't aware of. But what I wanted to do was to recreate repetitive events, things that I remembered happening over and over. So that's how I started doing interiors. And the reason I used flatness, it was completely intuitive. I realized that by using flattened space, I could, represent multiple areas of one room. And then in some of my works, I actually represent multiple rooms or even full floor plans, but you can include all 4 walls. You can include multiple viewpoints of a single object. So that is the way I started constructing these paintings. And so for the 3 in the show, they do come from a place of recognizing, in this piece that's on the screen, East View. It's, every winter in Chicago, the lake near my home freezes in this very magnificent, yet very, it's a disaster for the lakefront. It harms the trees. So there's this feeling that, that there's this beautiful, magical thing happening outside my window, but it's also destructive. And so that was the reason why I made this painting. And just this idea of looking out my window, it felt like a metaphor for the moment. And then in the painting with the orange chairs, what is it, Sunset and Fireworks, in June, and I really never worked this, what is it when you work in the present, contemporary, what is that word? Contemporary, what is it? Contemporaneously, that's it. So I was thinking in June, every evening we would sit on our porch, you know, we would watch the sunset, but because it was before the 4th of July and everybody was home in the pandemic, there were fireworks going off every night. And it was also during the protests when people were, you know, out on the streets voicing their complete, the unbelievable moment. And I just felt like this painting was like, it's a repetitive event. It was happening over and over every night, and the fireworks were happening, and I was able to capture it, I think. And then in the other painting, Holidays, we go off on a different tangent here. Sometimes in my work, I also try to capture or like snapshot in my head things that strike me as kind of cynical and humorous. You know, I go to my in-laws for the holidays, and the last time we visited in December, this was all they put out for a decoration. It was like they had just given up on the idea of a festivity, and I found it. And instead, what was showcased was their sort of kind of pretentious art collection. So I felt like this painting, it's kind of it's a critique, and it's also just this idea that, you know, as time passes, we get, you know, less and less excited about the things that are happening in our lives. So.
James, do you think about, I mean, do you want to talk a little bit about how these works come to be? Because they are certainly tied to time in a way that I think is interesting to explore.
Yeah, you know, I think time is really important for the whole exhibition. You know, I got to see the work in person, but really only after reviewing the works, you know, albeit online, did it really all come together. Even though I'd spent much of the summer, you know, talking to Elizabeth about the show as, you know, as the curator. I think one thing that we have in our homes are objects, you know, like photographs or paintings or I learned this word from Leslie's work at like Eperne, you know, or a candle holder, and these objects are, for me, I think, really different than like the videos or the films that you know that I spend a lot of time with. You know, I might watch like a 90-minute documentary on McDonald's, but after that I'm kind of done. I don't need to go back and watch it. But you know, to come back to like a photograph or a painting, I might just spend 30 seconds with that, you know, in the show, but that return is what makes that work really, really important. And I think that time is what for me brings it all together. In the studio, I think, you know, I'm in the studio a lot and working, but most of the time is spent just looking at the work, you know, and trying to figure out what needs to be done, and you know, finding the courage to make the next move or changing something that's already on the canvas.
Yeah, I think for me, I've always thought of time, like most people, I would assume, like as a construct. And when I was making these images, I made them over a period of maybe, I want to say like 1 to 2 months. And I wasn't actually intending for it to be a project per se. It was just kind of my own personal meditation on those moments. And I think for me, you know, having the privilege of being at home during quarantine and during COVID, it was the first time in a very long time where I kind of felt like the architect of my own universe in a kind of way, because I didn't have anywhere to be. There was nowhere to go. Really, there were not a lot of social obligations. Like I would have Zoom meetings and work meetings here and there, but for the most part, time really didn't exist in that space for about 3 months. And to kind of have that, for me, it was like a breath of fresh air. As someone, like most artists who have a gig life, or you're working, 3 different jobs at a time, or 2 teaching artist jobs, not sort of having those responsibilities gave me time to actually sit and think. And it was, I think, a privilege, and at some points almost felt dreamlike that I didn't have sort of a time to follow or any sort of schedule to follow, really. It was just me being with myself, being with my body, being with my partner, reading. And in a way, it was very leisurely. And I think even at moments, there was a sense of guilt because there was so much just like happening with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. But for me, my sort of response to everything was to just hone in deeper into myself, and gave me a sense of peace. And I think thinking of time, time is currency. It's, I think, connected to circumstance, it's connected to abilities, sometimes resources. And for me, I kind of reflected on this particular time as a privilege, and sort of recognizing that within that moment, even as there were like people who were consistently having the opposite experience, or people whose schedules didn't stop or still required to do things. Yeah, it was just I felt like I, at some points, was just in a dreamlike state. And sort of creating this like safe, like comfortable space where I could just reflect and process in the ways that I needed to.
I think maybe it's also significant that in the same way that James and Ann's works kind of use light and space, it's interesting though that they're often, there are flowers in this image or plants. So there's also like, a different kind of time scale happening of like, different of living things and of the days kind of. So there's like this different time is still existing, right? But it's sort of like you found a new way of measuring it, which, we often don't have the space to explore when we're out in the world and going through,
And it's funny when James brought up the flowers on the floor, because that was sort of like, so me and my partner were trying to replicate a movies at the park, and obviously that couldn't happen. So we got like a little picnic blanket, set it up in the living room, and sort of, I guess, recreated a picnic situation with flowers and dinner, and then projected a movie on the wall, just to kind of give some context for that. And I wanted to kind of document that moment as sort of, just another meditation on timelessness, and like having the privilege and ability to find new ways to like experience time when so many spaces were like restricted from us.
I think that kind of going off of these works, where I think the way you use language is really interesting as sort of a way of, visualizing how you like your inner monologue. I think in all of these works, I'm really interested in kind of this relationship between concealment and exposure, like how information is revealed and also hidden, as I think it can be in our sort of homes and living spaces too. The way that objects work differently for people who don't know them intimately and sort of have certain associations with them. So there's this sort of like this like intimacy offered, but also this preservation of a certain degree of privacy. And I want to talk a little bit more about those tensions. And James, I thought, because of the way you use sort of abstracted space as its own kind of landscape, if you have thoughts about that, this sort of how this information is potentially read by viewers.
That's a good question, Elizabeth. I think, as an artist, you want to share, but you don't want to give it away. Or you don't want it to, you want the viewer to discover over time. But you also don't want to lock things down. And I think in our world, in the visual world, the idea of a metaphor is very important for all artists, like poets and writers and for painters and whatnot. And I think in the visual world that metaphor happens when we look at the same thing, but start to see different things. Something that I really like to look for, just, be it literally wherever I am in the world, are shapes, like shapes that happen but between things, between people, between trees and foliage. And those are things that, those are the gaps that I like to look at. And for my practice, it starts with those gaps, and over time, I can kind of, move those shapes into things that I'm thinking about or dreaming about or whatnot. And I think I want to, I strive to leave them open enough so that other folks who come to the work might find things that, might also fill in the gaps in their own way.
Mm-hmm. And with your works, and maybe it doesn't apply so much to the, I've always wondered, because there are very rarely visible occupants in your paintings, right? And so there's like a very clear sense of specific domestic space with all of this really these specific objects particular to a person, but the person is absent. And I've always wanted to talk to you more about that, how you think about like the mysteries in your work, and how it relates to the people that live in these spaces that we actually can't see.
Yeah, so in the works in the show, this one here, Sunset and Fireworks, and then Eastview, I would, classify them as a little off the path that I've been following with my work for the past, I guess, decade almost, where so in these two works, it's much more personal. I'm doing more what James would be talking about. I'm actually revealing only what I choose to reveal here about my personal space. So they are not as what I would say, they're not inventories or investigations of a space, which is what I would say my past two shows have been about, and also the work leading up to those two shows, where I would, for the show I did in 2019, I actually used social media because it became so, it absorbed so much of our time, and there were so many images, and people were giving me very private information about their spaces. So I would collect their private spaces from their social media posts and then reconstruct their interiors. I had never visited these homes. Most of the people I did know, they were predominantly my cousins. I was trying to use, I always try to connect it to the personal, because I think that gives the paintings emotional power. I feel like if I don't have a personal connection, it does become a little cooled off. So I try to stay in the zone of the personal, or at least enough of a personal connection that I can imbue the painting with some kind of tone or feeling. But so in Holidays, I guess this painting is the closest to what I do in my more in my regular practice outside of being quarantined at home, is that I look, either I'm in the space or I have people photograph the space for me. It can be a different, it's the different approaches, but it's always coming from a place of trying to catalog somebody else's personal items and trying to reveal something about their social class, usually about how they live, and about how I sort of feel about that, usually in the title or in a way that shows that I'm choosing this because I feel like there's a need for people to see this interior space. I've done a couple paintings actually that are not explicitly political, but I have a friend who happens to work in events in Indianapolis, and he does events for Republican donors. He sets them up. And so then when he's there for me, he photographs their interiors. Don't tell anyone. But I then reconstruct those interiors from his photographs. So I'm giving a side eye saying, look how these people live, et cetera, et cetera. And, there's a tone to those paintings. So it really depends on the subject matter and what I'm thinking about. And I usually work in a theme, and I try to follow that theme down 7 or 8 paintings. And that's my way. And I don't need the people. I actually don't want them. I don't want to know the people. Or if I know them, I don't want the painting to be about those people. I want it to be about the objects in the room and how they arrange them, what their choices were. And usually even the architecture of the room will allude to their level of affluence or lack of. At the core, my work is really about class.
Do you think, though, also about, I guess you're kind of alluding to this, but sort of I think you said it once to me, the emotional affect of objects, or the objects are vessels for, what was it?
Objects can be containers of emotion. So, and especially if I'm working with, I think every artist does this. I have certain points that I always return to recenter myself. And my parents' home is somewhere I always return to find my center. I'm actually working on a piece about my parents' home right now. It wasn't my intention to do it, but I always am finding myself going back to that place. Not only because my parents happen to have very idiosyncratic decorative, they make idiosyncratic decorative choices. So they're great muses, but their objects for me contain emotion. Like everything in that house I know personally. My mom is she's a big fan of knickknacks and collectibles and things. So I grew up really thinking about objects as places to use my imagination, to feel like life has this magical quality to it, only to learn later that a lot of those objects are considered kitsch, and that kitsch is not considered art, and that kitsch is actually just a populist way for people to enjoy a very superficial aesthetic, connection to the world. So a lot of stuff is happening in the paintings underneath all this investigation of objects, but when they're about emotion, I'm usually returning to a personal place so that I can find that kind of psychic energy in those objects.
Zakkiyyah, did you find that in making this series of works that you thought about the objects in your home in your partner's in your temporary home, if you thought about like the objects in any way? Oh, your micro.
There was like some music off in the background. I think for me, I maybe really wasn't thinking about objects so much as my relationship to my surroundings. I mean, obviously there are a lot of objects like documented in the work, but James pointed out the records earlier, and there are also like a lot of books that I was engaging with, but maybe engaging with objects that I didn't have the time to engage with previously, or things that happen to sit around in our homes. I think people just collect things so much, or collect so much, that you don't have intentional time to engage with everything that you're bringing into a space, or everything that is inside of a space. And so I guess I was thinking about objects in that way. But to go back to this idea of thinking about concealment, exposure, and privacy, with the more recent works, I was thinking about ways to represent an identity or an experience that wasn't attached to a person or a figure. There are some, like this image, for example, there's a figure in this image, but the other piece in the show, the charcoal work, is really about, oh yeah, I think I can share that a little bit, actually. This piece, for example, was really about offering an emotional experience and an exchange that really doesn't involve a figure or a person necessarily, but more so a feeling, and sort of concealing that with graphite, concealing that with charcoal, so that a person who is engaging with this has no you can't really associate any identity to these pieces if you don't know the context of it. All you get is the text. And in this specific piece, hey, I've been concerned, that I think is applicable to any person, right, regardless. And so I really wanted to offer space to think about privacy or like intimate relationships or intimate exchanges outside of more traditional like representation of like a figure. And I think for me, because my past work is so different, most of that work has been the documentation of Black women and Black femmes in social and private home spaces, but sort of departing from that for a little while and moving into works on paper, I was really thinking about those themes around intimacy and desire and privacy and belonging, but in a way that was a little bit more abstract or offered more room for abstraction. And so in creating this, I really wanted people to be able to read these texts and relate to them, or be reminded of some sort of nostalgic moment or experience that is more universal on a human level, but also holding space for these relationships that I do have with other Black queer women that are public, but that are also very much private and intimate in certain moments. And so departing away from the image into the space was just sort of a different articulation of that offered more room, I guess, for you know, concealment, also bringing light to this idea of uncovering something. And so within this specific piece, you can see what I want you to see, essentially. But this is sort of where it began. So it began here, and when I was done, this is kind of where I ended up. And so that in and of itself was a different kind of process for me that allowed me to sort of have more agency over what I want the viewer to see and maybe what I don't want the viewer to see.
James, could we talk about paper planes? Just because I think that that relationship that Zakkiyyah just described is, I don't know if it resonates with this piece too for you.
Yeah, you know, I think for me, you know, thinking about how Zakkiyyah is talking about the audience is maybe a good way for me to kind of segue into this drawing. You know, I work alone. I think that I think about my audience a lot. It's something that I talk to my students about, is like, you know, maybe the hardest thing about being an artist is learning who your audience is. And it's not everybody, you know, it's not even gonna be everybody on the Zoom call. You know, you know, I'd like to think that my audience are my friends and my mom in particular. I think though, in practice that, you know, that I might just be my audience, myself. It's something that I think about. That this is a piece that I sort of, in a way, I've been working on a project with poet Sarah Bitter in Seattle, and you know, we're good friends. We've known each other for 20 plus years since college, and we've always wanted to work on something together. And so we agreed on working on a project on war, and you know, with none of us really having any real experience with war. What's funny though is that as you know, talking to Elizabeth, I was like, hey, this is, you know, this is what's up in the studio. I think you know, if you want it for the show, it would be great. But you know, ostensibly made it about war. And Elizabeth quickly said, well, yeah, I know it's about war, but it's also perfect for the show. And I think in that sense, because I'm always just thinking about what's in the home. And so the shapes that start off in this drawing are really just shapes that are grabbed from in my domestic life, you know, like between the plants that, you know, that I worked on during, you know, started growing during COVID, or between all the furniture and all the gadgets in the kitchen and whatnot. I think that, you know, there's working, you know, something about like our domesticity is just kind of, it's kind of permanent, you know, and I think that's true for a lot of artists. And that is just always part of my work, you know, like, you know, whatever you ask me to do, there's going to be some part of that that's always there. And I think that, you know, what I see in my home, you know, what's comforting it spawns what I think about. You know, the things that I collect, the things that I accumulate, the things that I keep are things I'm interested in because they remind me of something else. You know, like they remind me of a person, a dear friend that may have passed away, or you know, someone who shared an idea with me, or like a really great walk that I had in the forest. Those are things that I would say are all the things that might be in this drawing, but maybe I think all of our works, you know, in particular.
Yeah, and I think I remember, you know, talking about this piece and wanting it to be in the show because it, you know, our homes and our domestic spaces are still part of the world, right? So all of this, like Anne, you know, talking about the fireworks at the 4th of July, it's like we have these moments of solitude and perhaps of, you know, of memory and nostalgia, but always this sort of this awareness of or this sort of figuring out how we exist in a larger context as well. And I think that sometimes those thoughts, I think it's interesting how those thoughts can come about when you're, you know, having coffee in the morning, or, you know, when you're doing these really like kind of private rituals, all of a sudden a thought of this scale and kind of intrudes, or you're reminded of a different scale. And yeah. But I thought that something I wanted to sort of end on, but also kind of open up in some ways, is talking about how while these ideas, these questions around interiors and homes and rooms, again, they're in architecture, right? They're things that you've all kind of been thinking about in your work for a long time, but seen as this work is new and was made in this really particular moment of being in our interiors. I'm just curious if your explorations felt challenged or enlarged or stretched during these times, and sort of how it affected your practices.
Well, I can start because I'm, in addition to being an artist, I'm also a parent. And so one thing that happened for me during this time is I was less alone than I've ever been in my, I think in 2 decades. So I no longer had the space of isolation. I had 2 little people who kind of moved with me everywhere I went, and that included the studio. So they became much better artists for it. And I had to find ways to open up my practice. My way, I actually started exploring painting in a much more, I feel like, basic way. I feel like I became a better painter during quarantine. I didn't actually study painting. I come from painting through sculpture, and just through sheer force of will, I decided I was going to start making paintings. And my paintings are really constructed. They're labor-intensive constructions they have multiple steps. They take several months. So during the time we shut down, and then as we've moved through the summer, things have opened up more. But what happened in the spring is I became a more flexible artist. I'm very rigid, and I became, more open to letting things flow, to working in ways that are quicker in my work. And, I felt rejuvenated, although I have to say, I never lost the sense of anxiety. I carried it with me through the whole period, even though a lot of the things that we were doing during those times were joyous and togetherness was wonderful. I never was able to just calm down, which was interesting. But I found a lot of creative moments in times of day where I didn't usually flex my creative muscles. I was more creative in the evenings. I often worked in the afternoons when I always end my studio day at 4. So I started working 4 to 9, 4 to 10. Things really shifted around for me, and it had positive and negative effects. But ultimately, I think I made some work that I imbued with a different set of emotions than I normally allow in my work. Usually I'm a little more cagey. So I think that happened for me. That was how I experienced it.
Yeah. James, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a really, someone told me that these are strange times and also very interesting times. and it took me a long time to sort of unpack all of that. It was definitely difficult for me to make the work that I've been making for I would say my artistic career. Even as thinking about and just seeing all the things that are happening in the world. Our country has gone to shit. People across the globe are dying. And we're in a global pandemic. Everything is very different now, and it's hard to. I mean, it's impossible for us to forget that. It's why we're on Zoom right now instead of at a public institutional space together. I think a lot about William Kentridge and his work. I think that work was very much about trying to make, I would say very, successfully, like somber work that was also very beautiful when the world is shit. I think, to be very candid, this show was hard for me to become excited about. I mean, I was very excited to have an opportunity to show my work, to work with Elizabeth and be with these artists. But the time really made it hard for me to come to it. But I'm really glad that this show is happening because I think at this time, as I think Kentridge reminds us that we really do need to take care of ourselves. And I think self-healing is very important. And for me, and I think for many artists, our domestic spaces are where that happens. This is our comfortable space. And there's nothing like healing, like other than, reflection, I think is the best way to heal.
I really want to respond to that, like thinking about healing what James just said, because I know for me, when all of this happened, I got restricted to I didn't have access to my studio. And I'm an artist who traditionally in the past hadn't really required a studio space per se to make work, because most of my work was photographic and I was making it with other people in their spaces. And upon sort of venturing into these new charcoal drawings that I was like super excited about, that kind of got cut short when I didn't have access to the space. And I kind of need a designated space to make work like that, because the charcoal and the graphite is just so messy and isn't appropriate to work with in a home space. And so it's interesting because I did a drawing workshop that was led by an artist that I worked with at the MCA, James, who's a painter, and he led a drawing workshop. And I think since then, like I started just drawing in my space, and that kind of reignited a kind of healing for me and a curiosity about creating that necessarily wasn't attached to my quote unquote practice, which can be sometimes very methodical, intuitive, but oftentimes very methodical and influenced by a lot of things that I'm reading or watching. And having that loose drawing practice for me and doing that was like, for me at certain points, a moment to heal. Or I noticed that when I was drawing these really abstract line drawings, I wasn't really thinking about what they would be or what they would become. It just sort of became a space for play for me. And now it has ventured into my practice with some new drawings I'm making on architecture. But I think having a different creative practice that's not necessarily related to a quote unquote arts professional career or what it is that I'm doing, for me was like helpful at that time, or having books to read or watching a lot of films that I felt like were really interesting. But I think now having things open up again has been really exciting for me to be back in the studio, to be making work again or experimenting with work. And the quarantine, I think, also gave me space to rethink my practice as well, and really hone in on my most true desires. Because I think before, a lot of us are sort of responding to the pressures of making work for a particular thing, or being in a space all the time working. And so having that time, I've been able to redefine my practice for myself, and I'm now making things that are coming from a space of true desire and not really the expectations that I sort of had on my shoulder beforehand, especially as a Black artist, because I feel like the expectations are oftentimes a little bit different, or the work is expected to be politicized in some way or about my identity. And I think I'm moving into a space where those things are very much still present, but they're not so direct. And I can sort of play with abstraction or play with text in ways that I wasn't able to before.
I think it's also been interesting, right, to have isolation in the beginning also be sort of a responsibility, right? And so there was that role of this solitude actually serving as a reminder of our, impact on others, so that it's a complicated, it was a complicated time. It still is a complicated time. I think it's been about an hour. So Max, are there any or is there anything that anyone wants to add that you haven't yet?
I just to add to this, I guess, I think this is a sentimental show for me when I review all the work and when I think about my own home, and I think this is also a time. I think this is a time for reflection, but I think this is, for all the ways that we might think about sentimentality, I think this is also the right time for us to be sentimental.
I agree. And like being in the gallery, like I told Elizabeth, like I just felt like it was a very intentional and thoughtful show, and it felt very intimate just being in the space. And I think this sort of the size of the space as well further emphasizes that, being that there's elements of interiority or thinking about closeness. I just felt like the space was like really conducive for that concept. And also being in a gallery space, I think I said this to you, but I don't often walk in galleries and like see living things like plants or flowers. And it felt really nice to like walk into that space and see kind of like plants and flowers in there. And it added kind of like an air of like whimsical energy, but also felt very much like I was entering into someone's intimate private space. Not as an intruder, but kind of like being welcomed into that. And it felt very warm. Yeah. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, I'll follow up to say, I think if people who are listening are in Chicago, they should take the time, if they feel comfortable, to go see the work in person, because for me, it was thank you for including me and for putting together such a nice show, but also just to be able to go after months and months of looking at work on Instagram or on websites, even teaching, looking at students' work on Zoom is excruciating. To be able to see the surfaces and how the work is made, and just to be able to experience it again physically was a huge treat, and it's a worthwhile show, and also the show in the front gallery is worth coming out for.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yes, anyone watching, if you're in Chicago, thank you for the plug. The shows are up till October 17th, and you can make appointments on our website, which has also been really nice, because you do get kind of an individual appointment to spend time with the works in sort of a quiet space. So it's been truly so lovely to work with the three of you and the other three artists included. And Max, are there any questions?
I don't see any currently, but yeah.
Okay. I'll note, I've had a couple of people ask about the title, like if I got that from somewhere, and I was thinking about how I was really tortured over how to title the show, and just it went through a bunch of iterations, and I had also been making just making a lot of lists. You know, it was a time, I think these days are, I don't know, you find whatever kind of makes you feel comforted. And so it'd be like lots of lists and sort of inventory. And yeah, it was like a mirror dish a window. And Anne was like, yeah, let's go. Okay, let's do that. So, you know, sometimes like it's a simple, I don't know, it's like making a grocery list. And I was like, oh, that sort of taking inventory of these like disparate things that all come together into something. So, all right, if there are no questions.
Thank you guys. That was an amazing talk. And for me, the next best thing to being able to go see it in person.
Yeah, we wish we were in Chicago to see it. But thank you for this whole NADA weekend in Chicago. It's been really lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, this was a great conversation. And yeah, thank you everybody. Thank you to everybody who's listening still. And yeah, I hope you get to see the show in person if you can.
Well, thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.